All right, thanks very much. So I'm Brendan Dolan-Gavitt. I used to be a professor at NYU. Now I have jump ship to industry where I am an AI researcher at XBOW. I also want to introduce my co-presenter, Vincent Olesen. I want you all to write down his name because a few years from now, you're going to want to be able to say, I saw one of his early talks. Brilliant guy, very happy to be working with him. So today, we're going to be talking about one of what I think are the harder current challenges in automated web security, which is finding authorization and authentication bugs, right? And these are classically very, very difficult because as some of the earlier talks we've seen have already mentioned, it's all about verification, right? And so this is going to be largely about how do we find and verify vulnerabilities in authentication and authorization.
Yeah, so we were a bit unsure on what to call this talk. One of them was like N-1 factor authentication, or my favorite one, which was no auth.
But yeah, the moral of the story is that authentication is actually very hard, right? And why is it hard? Well, there's so much of it. We have HTTP basic auth. We've got OAuth 2.0, signed URLs, JWTs, OIDC, OAuth 1.0, Kerberos, magic links, session cookies, TOTP, LDAP. But what I think is probably one of the most common auth mechanisms in the world is custom auth, right? Where the developer just said, yeah, I'm pretty sure I know how to do this, wrote their own auth system, set up all their own authentication, authorization checks, and shipped it, okay? And so with all of these different types and complexities, you don't really have any hope of writing a classical validator that just says, yes, I can tell you exactly when this authentication fails. And so that's where we start to turn to AI.
Yes, what really matters is that the client and backend can work together. And even if people implement OAuth 2, it's not necessarily spec compliant. So the way we do authentication at XBOW is that we start with an agent with a browser, give it credentials, ask it to log in, and then just like with exploits, right, we might have false positives. So we validate, we have the validator for checking whether it's actually logged in. And then we also want to be sure that it understands and that it has reverse engineered enough of the application to actually like take the browser state and turn it into API requests. So we also have a validator for that. So if an agent passes these two checkpoints, we're pretty damn sure it's logged in. Now, it can be a bit hard, or these validators took a lot of effort to get right. So I think let's play a little game, which is like, is this logged in?
Yeah, do you want to raise your hand? Do you think you're logged into Apple here? Got some yeses, some people, many shy people.
So in this case, I thought I was logged in, but I wasn't. And another case we have here, right, is if we look at this request right here, just from this request, I wouldn't be able to determine whether the request is successfully authenticated. It could be a public phone book, right? And then the auth material likely doesn't matter. It could also be a medical appointment booker, and then this would likely be a real authenticated request. I think the trick we found is finding places in the app where there's a contrast between being logged in and logged out. But with these validators, how can we use it for evil? Right, so we have our agent. If it passes the two checkpoints, we're damn sure that it's logged in. What we could do is, instead of giving the username and password, we could just remove the password. If it logs in, then bam, we have an authentication bypass. So here's a very cute bug found by Horizon 3, which is very easily demoable. So what happened there was that the default secret key was hard-coded in the code. So our agent looks through the source code, finds a way to forge new session tokens using a secret key, the hard-coded secret key, loads the state into the browser, boom, admin access. And now our validators are happy. We can also find MFA bypasses, because to log in on sites that requires second or multiple factors, right? We need to give them access to those factors. So what we could do is simply just remove it. If the agent logs in, the validators check, boom, MFA bypass.
Okay, but one thing I always think about is like, okay, but it's actually somewhat rare to screw up so badly that you get a complete authentication bypass, right? Much more common is you have working authentication, but now you've messed up something about how people get authorized to access particular resources. So this is where I feel like we go from evil to diabolical. That's our goal in life, is to be as evil and diabolical as possible for good. So okay, let's consider this scenario. We've got one authenticated session as admin. Browsing around the site, it makes a request to some endpoint with its admin bearer token. Now, to understand whether that endpoint requires some kind of authorization, we would like to be able to make the exact same request, but under the context of a low-privilege user, right? But unfortunately, there's no guarantee that we can get something like that, right? Because if you just browse around as the low-privilege user, maybe you never even see the admin interface in the first place. And so what we want is some sort of magical transformation between the request as made from an admin context to a request as made from a low-privilege context, okay? And so we use the highly technical term auth transmogrification here. And it turns out that this is actually a script that you can get an agent to write for you, right? Its inputs are a browser state and a URL, and its output is a request as made correctly under that auth context, right? And so now we can make that request, and if we get a different answer as the low-privilege user, as the same answer as from the low-privilege user and the admin, then that means that the endpoint is potentially public, right? It may also mean that you've completely forgotten to do any authorization checks, so you have something like an IDOR, right? And we're actually going to not focus on IDORs for the rest of this talk. We're going to consider them out of scope, because that actually requires some judgment, right? That's a judgment call as to whether the response should be considered public or not, okay? So we're going to focus on instead, right? So if we get this back, we're going to say, okay, let's not be further interested in this for authorization bypass purposes. And instead, let's look at the case where you get a differential response, okay? So you access it as admin, you get back a user profile, you access it as a low-privilege user, and you get back a forbidden, okay? So the application is trying to do some kind of authorization check here. That does not mean they did it correctly, right? So let's assume that we're in this case where we get different responses. Now we have a very concrete goal that we can send an agent after. And we have a very concrete way to verify when that agent solves the task, when that agent finds a bypass, okay? So what does that goal look like? Given this endpoint and a low privilege context, find me what the response would be from the high privilege admin context, right? And this is great because now we can give this as an answer key to our validator, right? The validator is going to get to see what the response looked like under the admin session. The attack agent only gets to see what the URL is and has to produce the admin's response. Okay? Now, if it manages to do so, great. Now we have a validated authorization bypass. Otherwise, we can reject it. And this is great because as capable as these AI models are, when you give them a task like find a security vulnerability no matter what, they are going to end up making things up. Okay? So the other nice thing about this, I've been talking about authorization bypasses, but if you want to get very technical, we can also use this to find authentication bypasses at the API level by just saying, okay, one context is low privilege, one context is completely unauthenticated. Okay? And so this is quite nice. So there's actually a fairly wide variety of different things that you can detect with this, right? Because this covers things like JWT forging attacks, all the clever cryptographic tricks where you can take a token, change the claim somehow, re-sign it. You can find these broken object level authorization checks, session expiration kinds of things, hard-coded tokens, and these fun little ones like parameter bypasses where you try to access a URL, you get rejected, but then you add admin equals 1, and suddenly you're accepted. Okay? So again, in the spirit of show rather than tell, so last year we put in a bunch of manual work to set up an instance of the Redmine project tracker and try to find authorization issues in it by planting CTF-style flags in it and then using that as our verification. It turns out that if you're trying to deal with something like thousands of bug bounty targets or the entire open source ecosystem, you cannot go through, set all of those up by hand, and plant CTF flags in them. So we wanted to be able to see if we could reproduce this kind of vulnerability in a more automated way. Okay? And so the nice thing about this, now we have this script that can make requests from different authorization contexts. And so we can get this kind of nice prioritized list where we say, great, here are the endpoints that you want to look at that give different responses when you're authenticated versus unauthenticated versus authenticated as a low privilege user, or when you're authenticated as a low privilege user versus a higher privilege user. Okay? And so in this case, the one that we're going to look at is this projects endpoint down there, where when we visit it with a low privilege user, we see one public project. When we visit it with a higher privilege user, we see one public project and one private project. Okay? And that gives us the differential we need to say this is a target for an attack from the low privilege to the high privilege. So let's look at this trace. So this is where it started out. The other nice thing is that once you produce this script, it's a really powerful tool for the agent to use. It doesn't have to reverse engineer the authentication and authorization mechanisms every time, right? You just give it a Python script and it can use it now. It starts off by getting a baseline request. It discovers, okay, great. I see that I can only see this one project. We move on. It starts looking through source code. And by just the 5th iteration, it's actually already found the parameter that's going to allow it to bypass things. So it turns out that when you set admin projects equals 1, you bypass the visibility checks, right? And so it starts running the code, starts confirming it. It can use, again, this same authentify transmogrification script to get a differential between what it looks like with admin project equals 1, and without that, it discovers that, hey, turns out there's a secret project, right? And so it sees that there's another project that it's now able to see. It submits that to the validator, and now the validator, luckily, has a very, very easy job. It can just look at what was submitted, right? Okay, the agent submitted something that lets me see both projects. When I look at this with the high privilege user, my ground truth, it was also able to see both projects. That means the agent has successfully bypassed the authorization check. Okay? So this is quite nice, right? This lets us go very quickly to the vulnerability. And we found that also when we're giving it these very, very targeted tasks, we don't need very, very long-running agents to find these vulnerabilities usually. All right? So success. One thing I'll say that's not in the slides is we also have a much more fun vulnerability involving a case where by translating a URL from English into French, literally changing one of the words into French, you can bypass authorizations in a CRM and access any document. So if you would like to hear about that one, it's not fixed yet. So we're operating under what I call the Bureau Day vulnerability program, where you buy us a beer and we'll tell you about it. Okay, so this does have limitations, right? I called out one of them. These classical IDORs aren't something that we're trying to detect with this approach, because classical IDORs don't show this differential between different auth contexts, right? I go to, shopping cart /5, I go to shopping cart /7 as different users. I can see the same thing. Does that mean that I found an IDOR? Maybe, maybe not. You have to exercise judgment about the application there. We're looking for these more technical authorization bypasses. The other thing is that this is heavily dependent on the quality of that auth transmogrification script that the agent wrote, right? And so we really have to be very careful to make sure that it doesn't make very many mistakes when writing that script. But one thing that's kind of cool is we get tons and tons of built-in test cases for whether that script is working by letting agents just explore the site with a browser, letting the JavaScript code make requests and recording the responses, and then that gives us a test suite that we can use to validate this auth transformation script. All right, so thanks very much for listening. We had a lot of fun with it, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Who's got questions? Oh, there's always questions. I guess we really focused on like one specific validator. Can you kind of give us a sense of like how you came up with this idea and other types of validators that you sort of build?
I think for this one, we already had the login validators, right? So that it really was like, how could we misuse it, right? Using all components we had already. And then I think Brent and I met at a hackathon, and then we implemented it. And it worked. And we found some bugs.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, the other thing is that it really did come out of trying to just make the product more reliable, because getting logged in and staying logged in is super hard, but also super important for doing a good pen test in the first place. And so as we got these validators of, are you logged in? Are you still logged in? And really banged on them in some of the craziest sites you've ever seen, AKA internal banking apps. You end up finding a lot of the corner cases, ironing them out, and ending up with these really robust validators. And we wanted to then also reuse that work to be able to find cool new vulnerabilities too.
What else? Greg, we got one up here. Oh, up here. Mike's coming.
Thank you. Hey guys. By the way, OAuth 2.1 does force the spec, so fixes the 2.0. Just try to do it right. So this was great. Thank you so much. Are you proposing this as a way to enforce proper authentication for AI agents? Is just, hey, use this in agentic workflows, or is this like what? How can we use this in the world within agentic AI? Because I'm big on assigning identity and tightly bound scopes, so you can reduce the blast radius and the damage. Is that the problem this is solving?
So this was more aimed at saying, I have a web app that uses authentication and authorization, like many do. I want to bang away at this app and find the vulnerabilities in it before they get shipped, right? So this is more about the offensive security side, trying to find vulnerabilities in web apps, as opposed to securing the agents themselves.